Season 1 of House of the Dragon just finished up, so I'm here to rank all 10 episodes from worst to best. Be sure to let me know your ranking down below. Let's get started with number 10. Number 10, Episode 6, The Princess and the Queen. So this is famously the first episode after the massive time jump, where we saw an actress swap for both of our main female leads. A lot of people seem to have a big issue with the jump itself, but I can't say I do. Personally, I think the jump makes a lot of sense as we skipped over years of stewing and brewing with the same emotions. My problem is the actual contents of the episode, and what they seem to skip over in that. We are introduced to new characters, particularly Daemon and Rhaenyra's love interests, just for them to be killed off instantly. There are so many cool things set up to be instantly ripped away. I think we could have dropped off around here in the timeline, but just added an episode to flesh out these characters and get us tied to them a bit more. So when Daemon's wife we just met gets eviscerated by her dragon, it's not just an amazing visual spectacle, but also an emotionally poignant scene. There are other huge highlights, like the emphasis on Rhaenyra's fortitude being established with the massively long take that encapsulates her birthing her child and instantly walking up to meet Alicent. This also shows the deterioration of their relationship in a completely visual format, rather than having someone walk in and tell us, wow, you haven't gotten along lately with Alicent, huh? There are a lot more things that don't sit well with me, like Rhaenyra's blatant affair makes her character look more than foolish, Laenor comes off like a pseudo man-child, Sir Criston is stewing after all these years, and it feels jarring when we are introduced to the Strongs and Daemon's wife for them to be instantly killed. By far the weakest of the season. Number 9, Episode 4, King of the Narrow Sea. While this is a big step up from 106, it's still a bit disappointing compared to the better episodes of the season. The intro is fantastic, as we see desperate marriage proposals from across the realm that Rhaenyra instantly scoffs at. I love the kid killing the bully only to instantly throw up, showing violence breeds at a young age in Westeros. We get some quality time with Daemon's character this episode, and it definitely is solidified that his love for family is his defining characteristic. No matter how much of a man-child he can come across as, he really just wants his brother's love and respect, and you can really see it when he falls on Viserys for a hearty hug. The gallivanting around the town that Daemon and Rhaenyra do is a welcome change of pace for a time, but the episode comparatively feels inconsequential to the rest of the series. A drunken Rhaenyra goads Sir Criston into a night of fun despite his initial refusal. I like how it shows how spoiled and immature she is at the time, not thinking about the potential death sentence it could mean for him. It's hard for him to say no to a princess because he could be damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. She is the one who made him who he is at this point in the story. Any scene with the White Worm, though, is a weaker scene of the season for me, and unfortunately, she gets some solid amount of screen time here. Thankfully, it's made up for by a terrified Otto having to confront Viserys with the news of Rhaenyra and Daemon. It does feel slightly rushed how chummy Viserys and Daemon are in the middle of the episode, to then having Daemon banished and being kicked by Viserys. But it's an interesting character arc. And the final sequence has Otto fired from hand after a chat with Rhaenyra. Some of my favorite scenes of the entire season are Viserys fathering Rhaenyra, and this one is no exception. A decent enough episode, but again, nothing near the top. Number 8, Episode 3, Second of His Name. This is a notable climb in quality from the last 2 episodes, but while this episode is one with the most action of the entire show, it isn't directly tied to the main storyline. Typically in Game of Thrones history, we'd have established characters fighting each other, but here it's a crab feeder who is admittedly creepy, but not a character we know or understand the motivations of. Therefore, I'm not as invested in the battle sequence, even though it is really well done. They do a great job depicting the horrors of war here, and don't really glorify it at all, especially the terrifying opening sequence. Likely my favorite scene of the entire episode is Viserys and his drunken knight. I don't think I've ever seen drunkenness put so effectively to screen, and it's not just his drunkenness, it's also his loneliness. Seeing Lionel stand as a beacon of reason and honor was inspiring and something I missed throughout the later half of the show, as so many characters are hateable. The dialogue has a bunch of witty lines here, such as, "The gods have punished me for my indulgences," and the general hunt is an interesting premise for an episode. The boar attack is likely prophetic and genuinely a pretty startling scene. Oh, and how could I forget the Lannisters? Jason, is it? This guy's an absolute tool, and I love it. So fitting for the Lannies. So yeah, this is a solid episode and has a lot going for it, but there's some stiff competition in this show. Number 7, Episode 2, The Rogue Prince. What I like the most about this episode is how we delve into our characters and their relationships with one another. This is much less showy of an episode than most, but it manages to introduce intricacies to characters that we typically don't see in stories like this. A great example is Alicent's guidance of Rhaenyra following the death of her mother and brother. They share genuine connection, and it makes the eventual downfall of their friendship all the more tragic. The Game of Thrones is being played here smartly by Otto as he manipulates Viserys and his daughter into an intimate relationship. The big showstopper of the episode is the confrontation of Daemon and Rhaenyra and Otto at the bridge on Dragonstone. I love how Daemon gives due credit to Kristen Cole when he replies with a zinger, and I love the tension here. With dragons available to both sides, everyone could be dead in seconds, and you feel the weight of it. Like I said before, the Crab Feeder is a fittingly disgusting, depraved villain, and they do a great job building the horrific atmosphere around him in this episode. While the first half of the episode is weaker than the second, it's still full of solid moments. Number 6, Episode 9, The Green Council. Something I haven't mentioned yet is the music. While Ramin Djawadi's scores have always been fantastic, I love how he's incorporating more piano in this series as opposed to Game of Thrones. It makes both of the soundtracks sound distinct from one another, and it sets a more somber tone for the tragedy of this story. Viserys was the light of the show in my eyes, and far and away my favorite character, so seeing the grayed out King's Landing after his death felt like a fitting send-off. He was the glue of the realm, but also the glue of my sanity as he was such a lovable character to me in such a sea of horrible people. This episode is kind of a mixed bag of really high highs and somewhat low lows though. I love the scene locked in the small council chamber and the scramble for control and power in the wake of a kingly death. There are not many good people in this show, so seeing 3 people resist Otto's planned takeover was refreshing. Beesbury ends up dead, the Kingsguard guy ends up resigning, and Alicent slightly resists. The search for Aegon tells us more about his character without having to dump exposition, and it's such a unique take on the scramble following a king's demise. Aegon's turn is understandable, although slightly rushed, and the ending is shocking but earned. But then we have the White Worm making a self-righteous power play randomly in the middle of the show. She feels disconnected from the reality of the world of Westeros, and is frustrating to see every time she goes on screen. So although there are some fantastic scenes in this episode, there are some weaker ones too that make it almost at that midway point. Number 5, Episode 5, We Light the Way. After Episode 4, I started getting worried about the show. I started getting worried that the show didn't have the wow factor of Game of Thrones. It seemed like the show had been solid, but slightly treading water for the previous few episodes. Thankfully, Episode 5 came in to be a savior to the bombast of the series. It's not perfect by any means, but it is really damn good. The inconsistent moments include Daemon's slightly goofy killing of his wife. The confrontation is great, but the way she seemingly accidentally falls with her horse just feels strange. The other weaker moment is Larys's introduction, as although he is a relatively decent character, he feels borderline comically evil at times and very heavy-handed in this scene. I'm not the biggest fan of younger Rhaenyra, although I am sympathetic to her plight. I had to wonder why she spent the first 4 episodes straight complaining about the responsibilities and inheritances just to turn down Sir Criston's proposal. In the end, I came up with spite, as I think when she hears she can't have the throne as a woman, it inspires her to commit fully to the possibility. There are so many iconic scenes, from the candid lamentation of Viserys' life and past, Alicent's entrance to the feast, which is highlighted by her awesome theme, and Alicent and Otto's speech towards the beginning of the episode. Obviously, the main highlight, though, is the entire feast sequence, which made me more anxious than any other moment in the show. You knew something was going to go wrong, but you had no idea what it would be. They set up so many possibilities, Daemon going insane, Criston enacting vengeance, or a potential thieving of the princess. And when stuff actually does happen, they only show us people's reactions and not what actually is going on, which builds the tension even more. The final sequence with piano voiced over with the marriage and an attempted suicide wrapped it all up in a shocking and gratifying Thrones bow. Number 4, Episode 10, The Black Queen. This is the one that's freshest in my brain, and I really enjoyed it. It was mildly disappointing to realize this season was basically a setup for the real story that will begin in Season 2, but it was an extremely effective setup. I appreciate that for the entirety of the season, they committed to this smaller scale family drama. In the medieval ages, family drama between powerful families would and could result in the deaths of hundreds of thousands. So building a compelling foundations for the true battles of the future is going to make them so much more gratifying. They did a decent job making each side mixed, although by the end I am heavily on Rhaenyra's side. I particularly enjoyed how they made Aemond accidentally kill Lucerys, as it demonstrates that these are essentially kids messing around with nuclear weapons. He comes across as extremely evil to me, but in this scene he kind of had a little more humanity to him. He genuinely looked upset at his accident. The episode was shocking yet contained. But again, what made me most excited were the prospects it set up for the future. Hearing them rattle off house names from Game of Thrones, Baratheon, Stark, Aaron, it made me itch for the potential future in which we enter a House of the Dragon era of Game of Thrones scale. Obviously, there are other highlights like the visceral and graphic miscarriage, but as a whole, this was just a solid send-off. Number 3, Episode 7, Driftmark. This episode highlights one of the biggest strengths of the show, and that's their ability to sit in the wake of a disaster. We don't always rush past something. That's why the time jumps can be frustrating at times, because it's moments like Lena's funeral that really solidify the show as something special. The vast majority of it is just glances back and forth, but so much is said with so little dialogue. Characters are still given moments to shine despite the quiet, such as Daemon's outburst of laughter at the Valyrian chiding. I especially like the camaraderie between Rhaenyra's and Daemon's kids, as it shows some long-needed light in such a dreary sequence of episodes. Thankfully, Rhaenyra and Daemon's eventual union is as tasteful as it can be, and didn't frustrate me like their pseudo-union in episode 4. And while this is going on, we have Aemon conquering Vhagar, one of the coolest scenes of the entire show so far. The way they emphasized his relentless scale made me clench my fist in anxiety. And then this all hit home with the real consequences for his actions, with one of the most brutal fights in the series, and it's between the kids! I actually thought someone was gonna die when the rock was picked up. It also was kind of a twist because prior to that moment, I was absolutely rooting for Aemond. He criticized his disgusting brother and he seemed more mild-mannered. I guess the minor bullying inspired him into a relentless rage as he finally got a taste of power though, and he instantly became one of the most vile members of the cast. The highlight is obviously the lengthy confrontation though, a scene which feels like it lasts for hours because of how stressful it all is. My only complaint is that there was no real punishment for Alicent's violent outburst, but I suppose that fits Viserys' weakening character. I guess my one other complaint is that the fake nighttime scenes were clearly filmed in the daylight and dimmed. They just looked horrible. The final twist was a nice addition, with Laenor escaping safely to live his dream life. And this is an episode that played as the culmination to so much endless build-up, and the confrontations were mesmerizing. I could hardly find myself peering away from the screen from start to finish. Number 2, Episode 1, The Heirs of the Dragon. I think the pilot is an episode that is criminally underrated. I think this could be the best pilot of any show I've ever seen, and for 1.5 million reasons. Nobody was in a good mood following the ending of Game of Thrones, and this show had the impossible task of actively winning us over, despite such a negative start. Yet it did so in the strongest possible fashion. After my first watch, I was stunned at how much I loved the episode, so I waited a while and did a rewatch, only to discover I loved it just the same. Just about every choice is perfect, from the opening narration to Daemon's initial entrance, the anxiety built around the prospect of the birth, the perfect brutality of the city watch. This episode masterfully creates uncertainty of what's to come next, and it made me transfixed to the screen from start to end. I think the birth scene might be the saddest in all of the Thrones universe for me, and it's spliced with the brutal jousting scenes flawlessly. I love the building of these tragic family dynamics between Viserys, Rhaenyra, and Daemon, and the funeral feels just so brutal to me. I don't understand how in such a short period of time they managed to get me so attached to characters, and have my emotions turned up to 11 in almost every scene. There's no wasted time or useless dialogue, and the sets are perfection. Another highlight is how despite how much Daemon comes across as a villain, he is absolutely right sometimes. This creates layers and complexity between Viserys and Daemon. Nothing is so simple. Viserys is a generally kind and compassionate man, yet he does the most brutal act of the entire episode, sacrificing his wife for his potential heir. Daemon is generally a selfish and violent man, yet he genuinely cares for his brother and his well-being. I can't think of anything I'd change in this flawless setup episode. But number 1 is Episode 8, The Lord of the Tides. I didn't think it was going to be possible to top the pilot, but from start to finish, this episode is perfection. I could see why this episode would rank lower for people who aren't as invested in the character of Viserys, but as he is by far my favorite of the show, an episode devoted to him, his legacy, and his triumphant return is something that gripped my heart and didn't let go. It's definitely a sad episode, but it's also an inspiring one, as Viserys powers through leeches in his council to give one final proclamation of support for his beloved daughter. Seeing Daemon pick up the crown as he stumbled up the stairs was a moment that shocked me more than any battle could, and sold me on this universe and on these characters. The dinner scene had me holding out hope, Not for the children, but for the parents in this upcoming war. It had me begging that there would be some sort of reconciliation, although you know that this world is one of tragedy, not of compassion. I loved seeing them rally for Viserys so he could die thinking he mended his broken family. It makes you wonder what his life could have been like if he escaped the unbearable weight of duty. No doubt he would have lived longer and happier. And after episode 7, I was concerned that they had butchered Alicent's character into a mad queen, hell-bent on the destruction of all things for her own desires. But thankfully, we get touching, dramatic scenes with her where she genuinely has her loving touch returned, although it's combined with the cruel grasp of ambition. She is mixed, as all great House of the Dragon characters are. Every conversation is powerful and purposeful, and I'd put this amongst the best of Game of Thrones as well. As for the season as a whole, I absolutely loved it. I think this is at least as good as Season 1 of Game of Thrones, and I'm extremely excited to see where they go next. But that's just my opinion. What about you guys? What is your favorite episode of House of the Dragon Season 1? Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and see you later. Peace.